out there, and welcome to Answers for Today. My name is Bill Wynn. I'm here in Studio G with Pastor Terry Reynolds from Agape Chapel and Pastor Chris Quintana from Old Path, Calvary Old Path. I love that name. Good name. One of the topics that we've heard a lot about from people is the fact that all roads lead to heaven. And in fact, not all roads do lead to heaven. And one of the things that we're all about on this show is helping people to discern and make good decisions about their model for life. And one of the things that you have to do, whether you like it or not, is develop a worldview. And if you don't develop a worldview, you're going to have one by default, which is secular. And really doesn't necessarily fit with any of the realities of we know to be true about the different religions in the world. So what we're going to do today on the show is we're going to go down through several of the major religions in the world and compare them and see how they are different, and in fact prove that not all roads do lead to heaven, and give you the context for how to evaluate different religions and Christianity, of course. The important thing here is that you as an individual need to come to terms with what your own version of reality is. Each of us kind of has a different story to tell and a different life experience. And what's important is that your beliefs fit the reality of your life. And I think you'll find that when we're through with this series of programs that Christianity by far is the number one belief system or religion, if you want to call it that. We don't like to call it a religion. We like to call it a relationship. But it's the one that fits reality. And so with that, Terry, we'll hand it off to you, and we'll plow through how do we compare world religions.
You know, Bill and Chris, this is so important because it really goes against the grain of popular society and their thinking. They don't want to hear that. In fact, they would come against us because we're not very loving, we're not very kind, and saying that the Bible is the only way, you know, because that's the whole, goes against even the politics of the day, where everybody's got to get along and we can't have any absolutes. But guys, so what we like to show is that every one of these different religions, and Chris, I'm going to have you jump on and explain it here in a little bit, does have its own core values and its own core structure of thinking, and so what we want to do is lay it out there for what the Bible, really Christianity, stands up against them, and let people make their own decision. So Chris, why don't you jump in and explain a little bit what we're doing here?
This was in answering a question that kind of came up. What we're going to examine here was something that we did at church on one of our evening studies, because prevailing thought now in the world is that really all religions ultimately are the same, and whatever it is that their concept of God is, really they kind of all end up in the same place. We were talking before the program that people would say, well, all roads lead to God. You know, there's an element of truth in that, because he'll judge the living and the dead, all mankind. Every person who's ever been born will stand before him someday and be judged. The Christian doesn't fear that, because we look at him as the one who saves. The unsaved, the people who have rejected him, they'll stand before him as well. It just won't have the same end result as the believer. So in the topic, this is probably most prevalent because in the world now we're discussing Islam. In the Western world,
it's the popular religion of the day. Yes.
Yeah, and we're seeing it much more promoted here in the West than at any time before. And so people would look at Islam and say, but it's a monotheism, just like Christianity and just like Judaism, so it ultimately is the same thing. When we examine other isms, there isn't the idea of one God, so we're not even comparing apples to apples in that whole discussion. But when it comes to Islam, that is much more of a side-by-side comparison that we would want to do. So what I what I proposed to do was to ask a series of questions, and there are 10 of them. I know that you'll be putting them up on the screen. And we should ask all different views to, answer those questions. Would they be answered the same way from the isms, all of them when compared? And then it's when you do that that we as Christians should try to put away the notion that the God of the Bible is in any way similar to any other of the belief systems of man, because you wouldn't answer these questions the same way even within Islam. Yeah. And so we can look through the 10 if you'd like to.
We're not trying to pick on any one of the religions, but what we're trying to do is I'm going to ask the guys to take a look at the doctrines of the different isms and like Chris says, Islam and Christianities, and then let's take a look at them, ask these questions, and then let's just simply make our own decision. Is the Bible unique? Is Christianity unique from the rest of the scriptures? Is that basically what we're saying, sure, guys? Okay. Well, what I like to do is, like Chris said, we put up on the back screen here is these 10 questions that we have, and I like to get right into them, and maybe we could, Bill, why don't you take the Christian perspective of these, and I'm going to ask you a question, and then maybe you could tell it, and then Chris, you could jump into some of the other religions, and we could talk about them. And the first one is a simple one. Is God a person? Does the Bible tell us, or does Christianity believe that God is a person?
Well, Christianity, of course, does believe that there are 3 parts to God, and that those 3 parts are one, and that whole is a person. And it is a person who can exist in different forms, if you will, the person of God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit. That's how Christianity views it, and clearly from the beginning of the Bible in Genesis 1, God refers to himself as a person and as us. So as more than one person, in other words, a Trinity. So to answer that question from a Christian perspective, yes, he is a person. He is relatable on the same levels of a person. Now, one of the things that people get confused about is that sometimes the Bible will use an anthropomorphism.
That's a big word.
Which is they will attribute personal attributes to the supernatural God, okay? And the supernatural, granted, we don't know exactly. We know hints from the Bible. What it says is, like Jesus says, if you've seen me, you've seen the Father. But we also have places in the Bible where it says that God will gather us, his children, up like under his wings, yes, like a rooster or a hen might do. So you don't want to get confused about those kind of anthropomorphisms where they give God the attributes of a limited man, a finite man like we are. But he is a person.
So we determine that the Bible declares that God is personal. Chris, we have here Islam that we want to take a look at. Hinduism, Buddhism, and maybe secular humanists. Why don't you touch on those briefly on these?
For question 1, is God a person? We can say, yeah, he's identified, as Bill has said, as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, so person. Islam would say, yes, Allah is a person. Even within Hinduism, you would have the various deities that would be seen as persons, but there's kind of a degrading when we go through those ones where you know so little about them because they reveal so little about them. Most religions, when you start to compare what's being taught, become much more philosophical than they are theological or doctrinal. So read the writings of Hinduism and Buddhism, and you'll find that they're mainly philosophical. The writings of Islam would be much more political and yes, somewhat philosophic, not an awful lot of what we would consider as theology and doctrine. Those persons, when they reveal themselves, what you'll find within Christianity, when God reveals himself, and we've talked about this on other programs, he'll tell you that he loves you. He'll give you demonstrations of that love. He will come alongside and give direction, immediate direction to his people. So when you start to see, is he a person? Yeah, and he's also very much interactive with his creation. and that makes him distinctly different from any of the other persons that the other religions could get could promote. And what you'll also notice when you consider those religions, most of the time when those deities show up, they do it for some perverse reason to just mess with their creation more so than interact and demonstrate that they love. It's why those religions tend to sacrifice to their gods as a way of trying to appease them and keep something horrible from happening to them. So again, that the person of the God of the Bible reveals himself Old Testament and New Testament, and it's done for the reasons of love and compassion and mercy, but also of judgment and correction.
You know, Chris, one of that I think we need to speak on is secular humanism, because it really shapes our country. Sure. To answer the first question, is God a person in the secular humanist mind?
Sure.
What's their answer?
Yeah, look in the mirror, because you're looking at God at that point. You are your own deity. You are your own authority. So humanism, I mean, it's right there in the word. Yeah. It's the ism of humans, and so you could even call it the ology or the study of human, because you are your own authority. You're your own entity. You are your own God.
So to take a look at the question then, is God's personal? You would take a look at Christianity, you would say yes. You would look at Islam, say yes. Somewhat. And the rest of them, probably not. And secular humanists, you would say, no, they're atheists.
Yeah, because with Islam, you would get where Muhammad would say, Allah is gracious and merciful, not loving. That He's gracious and merciful. It's not that God revealed Himself that way. We have to take Muhammad's word for it. Yeah. And ultimately, we don't have any of the writings about even the person historically of Muhammad till a couple of years after he was gone. That's when you have your earliest possible of the writing of the Quran. Completely different in the that he is personal means that he has interacted personally with his creation. We can look at Abraham to Moses to David to the kings, and God would interact directly with His people. Let alone Christianity, when God becomes flesh and dwells among us. That is totally unique in all of the isms of man. The closest that you get is Islam, and it's nothing like that.
So that kind of moves to our second question: is God personal? Is the God of the Bible personal? And then, Chris, maybe you could elaborate a little bit more of these other religions. Are they personal? Go ahead.
Well, I think that to me is one of the key questions of measuring your reality against what a particular belief system contends. And when you think about, well, who is personal to me, that would mean that person would be involved, right? They'd be close to you. They'd be involved. They would speak to you when you ask them to, and they would give you wisdom, okay? In other words, they would enhance your life in a way that would create blessings, okay, and not travail or calamity, as they call it, right? So a personal relationship or a God who is personal would have to have, I think, those attributes. And we see in the Bible clearly, God, not only in the Old Testament where He spoke and showed up in person and showed up in the way of angels and every other thing possible where He spoke to the prophets and the various...
So trying to communicate in a personal way.
Correct. And then we had Jesus, who spoke to us in a way that was recorded, and there are eyewitness testimonies about what He spoke. And then when Jesus ascended, He said He would send the Comforter back to continue to guide us and to come alongside of us and to guide us in the way of wisdom, if you will, in the form of the Holy Spirit. And that happened, of course, we know at Pentecost. And so as a result, we know that at least the God of Christianity is very personal. He's very involved. And in fact, He wants to take control of your life in a good way and lead you and guide you in the path that leads you to blessings and prosperity and all the other things that come from a bountiful Christian life, because he loves us. And it's a fundamental thing that comes out of the person. And when you start thinking about, what's a personal God, you start thinking about, well, if he's personal, you'd have to know his personality.
Yes.
Which also means you'd have to know his character.
Chris, what about these other guys?
Sure. The best way to understand them is to have a really good understanding of how God shows himself in the Scripture. If you look at it from the very beginning, it is a personal God, and his relationship with the people is always dealing with things like mercy and compassion, love, all those types of directional relationship things that he has with his creation. But it's all because of the central theme to that is because of what we would call sin. And so as far as sin is concerned, that separates man from God. That's what the Bible teaches. So God would continue to reach out to his people to let them know that there's a way of reconciliation, but it's done on his terms. You compare that to Islam. When it comes to Islam, Islam does not teach such things because it becomes works. So a person will hope that when they stand before God someday that they have more good works than bad works, and that will take care of the issue of sin. So when you look at the other isms from that point on, sin's not even an issue. So a person will continue to perfect themselves over a series of lifetimes when you get into the other isms.
Yes.
And that the Bible doesn't teach anything like reincarnation as some of the Eastern religions would teach, let alone humanism. Humanism would just say you're dead and that's it. So when it comes to the comparison of that, God would say, from the very beginning I created perfection. Man, because of his willfulness, sinned against my perfection and my direct instruction to them. So God's desire has always been fellowship with mankind, so a remedy was needed.
Yeah.
And so somehow sin had to be overcome, and it was going to be done by people putting their faith and their trust in the God who perfects the human. That is not what you find in Islam. It is good works versus bad works. The other isms don't even believe in a personal God that you would spend eternity with. Wow. So when it comes to Islam, the last part of that, even when paradise comes about, what we know of their eternity or their heaven, at that point, Allah is not even present with his creation. We don't spend, the Muslim would not spend their eternity in the presence of Allah who loves and redeemed them. That is not the teaching of that, let alone the isms of man. Only in Christianity do you find God saying, I redeem because I desire to be present with you in the eternal sense, but it's done on his terms.
So the Bible really declares a personal God.
Absolutely.
And you start speaking about eternity. We're going to be talking about that later in the programs, what's distinct between Christianity. So the third question I think is very important for us to understand, and it is now that we know that their stance on is God a person, and is God, is he personal? So how does he reveal himself? How does the God of the Bible reveal himself? How does all these isms reveal himself, Chris? And why don't we flip it a little bit? Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit, and then Bill, why don't you follow up with the Bible?
Well, the isms, Islam would say that there were direct revelations given to Muhammad from Allah, and so it's one person. He only had these two revelations that took place in a series. One, the first, or the two, one in Mecca, one in Medina, separated by a number of years, and they really do have a very different feel in them. So
these two different revelations.
Yes, one was much more passive, and the other one was much more warlike. And really, you can understand why, because he had the numbers by the time that the second bunch of revelations came out.
I don't want to interrupt you, but what year are you talking about, or what period of time are you talking about when
You're talking 7th century?
7th century.
Yeah.
Okay.
So what you have in those revelations are we have to take the word of Muhammad, that what he says is true and accurate in what was conveyed to him directly by Allah. So what you get is his recording of those things, and like I say, when you compare them, they're very warlike, they are very much political, and so there are people who have actually taken the time. A friend of ours at Living Oasis Ministries, Elijah, has some of the breakdown percentage-wise of how much of the Quran is dedicated to various topics. And between being political and dealing with war and things like that, that is the lion's share of the writings there. So when it comes to how does he reveal himself in Islam, it is strictly Muhammad being spoken to by Allah, and we have to trust his recording. When it comes to the other ones, they're just an accumulation, thousands of years old, but they become far more philosophical. They're not as much theological, where they tell you about the nature of God and his interaction with his people. They're much more philosophical. They're really trying to perfect the person by their own efforts, and it will happen over a course of lifetimes, an infinite amount. You don't know how many. So humanism, obviously, it's kind of its own little thing. It's,
well, because there's
man's its own authority.
No God,
right.
So thus nothing's revealed other than what they think is right.
Sure. Yeah,
you know,
it's the God of education.
It's the book of Judges applied to the atheist. Everybody did what was right in their own eyes.
Well, that's important for us to say, though, because isn't that individually or groups of people who have tapped into whatever education they might have or what they've been, and that has really shaped in secular humanism.
Yes.
In that postmodern type of area that we're in right now. Yeah. The Bible. How is God revealed through the Bible?
Okay,
we had one, as he was talking about Islam. There's a little bit different.
Well, and I think it's important to note that one goes back to the 7th century. It has one guy that you have to believe that his recollection of whatever the revelation that God had to him, that Allah had to him, is correct. The Bible goes back more than 2,000 years from, it'd be actually 2,700 years from when Muhammad had some of his dreams or whatever they were. And so we end up with a history that goes all the way back to the beginning of the earth, which many would contend is 10,000 years ago. And it speaks to how the earth was created and things were created at the time of creation. So we have a book that not only has an account that goes way prior to the others, but that also speaks about God, not so much about man's ability to work his way like Buddhism and maybe secular humanism might say. And we have it revealed through the scriptures, the authors, the way the scriptures fit together. And
the unity of
unity of the scriptures. So we don't just have one guy's account. We have 44 guys' account, right? We have a number of accounts of different perspectives on different events that would validate one another when you put them together. Okay,
what you're saying is there's one story made by a whole bunch of different authors, different periods of times, and they all came together with one story.
Correct.
And there's a really important distinction here that we have to make sure that we make. And that is that the Bible speaks in a number of ways of total absolutes. Now, the only other place where you will find absolute statements made, like it is, this paper is white, there is no disputing this. You will find absolute statements made in Islam, but you will find absolutely direct contradictory statements. So much so that there's a rule of interpretation within Islam, like, well, wait a minute, there's one that says have peace with people, and then the next one of the surahs, you're meeting a verse that says cut off their heads. So how do you reconcile totally contradictory, views? And it's a rule of interpretation called abrogation. So what does the rule of abrogation say? You take the newer revelation and it supersedes the older. If you have what some people would say contradictions in the Bible, they're never on absolutes. They're always on, well, was it 30,000 or was it 32,000? It's always little silly things like that. Or in cases like with, people always love to say, well, wait a minute, James says that you're saved by works, but Paul says that you're not. If you have a person that actually believes that that's a direct contradiction, it simply means that they don't understand what's being said in the text. It is not a contradiction. So that is an important distinction, because even in the writings of Hinduism and Buddhism, it's not a series of absolute statements with eternal consequence like you have in the Bible and in the Quran and the Quran will sometimes meet it is arguing against itself. So what's to be done with that?
Chris, and go ahead, Bill.
Well, I was just going to add a couple more things. So we have a document in the form of the Bible that goes back thousands of years before these other documents came to fruition. Even in China and some of the earlier Buddhism and Hinduism, the Bible discusses events prior to that. It talks about the creation. But you also have, on top of the unity of the Bible and the one story from different authors, you have 3 different languages that it was written in that all agree with the events. You have all these different authors over different time periods that all agree with the same story. You have the miracles that were performed that were actually demonstration of God's involvement in the creation of the book. And you have the prophetic nature of the Bible in the sense that it tells us what is going to happen in the future. And virtually every case that's happened where the event has occurred.
That's what I was going to talk to you guys or ask you about, but we're going to have to keep that for another program, is the uniqueness of Bible prophecy. But, Chris, I do want to go back. I don't want to skip over the Hindus and how they reveal, because that's a mystery to a lot of us, trying to understand. If you could give us in a thumbnail sketch, how do they reveal themselves?
Or God revealed
Philosophical more than anything else, because you don't have direct communication. You will read through those things, and the gods are revealed by the people writing rather than the gods revealing themselves. And there's such a multitude, really, when you get into it. It's almost like what you saw with Paul when he was walking around Athens, and he was seeing this multitude of gods, that there are literally hundreds of millions of gods that would interact in some way with the creation. It is just almost overwhelming to try to come into some kind of an understanding of how they actually believe what they believe. When it comes to Buddhists, when it's all said and done, you just kind of are absorbed into nothing ultimately. It isn't a personal type of a thing. And before we are done with this program, let me make sure that I say, and I know I say it on behalf of all of us, this is not to go ahead and try to pick fights or mock other religions. It is just very simply to say each one of the belief systems of man has their set, here's what we believe. If we're going to be honest with what we believe, we should be able to compare side by side with all of the isms, which is all that we're doing.
Yes.
It's not to mock, belittle, or anything else. It is just to say, if there is this belief that all gods are the same and that religion is just the same, it's just done in different idioms, it doesn't stand up to a simple scrutiny of the major tenets of the theology of the Bible.
We just got started. Oh, my goodness. We got exciting programs ahead of us. Tell your friends, and we'll see you next time.
Information about this broadcast, or if you have any questions, feel free to mail us at Agape Chapel OC, P.O. Box 4023, Huntington Beach, California, 92647. Or you can email us at aft@agapechapelOC.org. Or visit our website at agapechapelOC.org. Until next time,